Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS Legal Hotline lawyer. And today we're going to talk about lease options. You should have a very different perspective on lease options depending on whether you're representing the seller or you're representing the buyer. And I will tell you that when I, as a lawyer, have represented sellers who tell me that they would like me to draft a lease option for them or just talk about the notion of a lease option, my number one priority in that scenario, and I think it should be yours as well, listing brokers, my number one priority in that scenario is to talk the seller out of a lease option. There is, simply put, nothing good that can come to the seller from a lease option. Think about what a lease option is. A lease option is a scenario where in most cases, seller has been trying to sell their home and they've not succeeded. They haven't sold the home to a buyer who will come to closing and pay cash for the home. And instead they have a buyer who says, you know, I'd like to buy your house, I think, but I'm not ready yet, but I need a place to live. So how about I live in your house for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, whatever it is, and I'll pay you rent. And more often than not, the buyer and the seller say something along the lines of, a portion of your rent will go towards your down payment, buyer. So buyer's paying this hybrid of rent that may or may not be market value, but a portion of it's being credited towards some future down payment or earnest money. And then buyer gets the right to purchase seller's property in the future, not an obligation, but the right to purchase seller's property in the future at today's value or at whatever terms are negotiated today. And remember, these terms are negotiated by a seller who's already failed to sell their home. So they're feeling a little desperate in most cases. So the seller is locking themselves into a purchase and sale agreement at whatever the seller views as today's value, that the buyer may or may not choose to execute as a contract in the future. Now, why would a buyer ever agree in the future to exercise that option and purchase seller's home? Would the buyer do that if, for example, the seller's value has declined? If the seller enters an option contract figuring that the value of the property today is $100,000, but 18 months from now, when the buyer's option is up and buyer is either going to exercise or not exercise the option, let's say that the property value has dropped to $90,000. Is that buyer going to exercise the option? Absolutely not. Why would they? They can go out and buy something else just like seller's home for $90,000 instead of $100,000. Seller got no benefit, no advantage from that lease option contract. When would a buyer exercise an option? Well, if the seller and the buyer view the seller's property worth $100,000 in today's market, and 18 months from now, when the buyer wants to exercise the option, the property is worth $110,000, well, then the buyer is going to exercise that option. Seller loses. Instead of being able to actually sell the property for what it's worth 18 months from now, having carried the property for 18 months, because that's what seller has done, buyer may have been paying rent, but seller has still carried that property. Seller has been subject to the Landlord-Tenant Act, carrying that property with the buyer as a tenant for 18 months. And now buyer gets to purchase the property for more than the property, the property is worth more than what buyer is going to pay as a purchase price for the property. Seller loses. So in both scenarios, seller loses. So maybe what your seller says is, yeah, but I can't sit here with my house empty and on the market indefinitely when I'm not finding a buyer to purchase the property. Well, then seller, you need to make a cognitive decision, a cerebral choice. Do I want to be a landlord or do I want to lower the price? Because seller, those are your options. If you want to be a landlord, then seller, go be a landlord. Go find an actual tenant to lease your property. And here's an absolutely critical caveat. Seller, work with a lawyer who knows property management law in Washington, landlord-tenant law in Washington state. Do not let any seller become a landlord haphazardly or by accident. If seller becomes a landlord under today's Residential Landlord-Tenant Act, seller must do so with forethought and intent. Do not accidentally become a landlord. And seller, if you don't want to become a landlord after you talk about to a lawyer who understands landlord-tenant law and you understand the risks of being a landlord in Washington state, if you then don't want to be a landlord and you also can't sell your property, then at that point you may need to lower the price of the property so that you can actually sell the property. Only out of an act of absolute desperation should a seller ever contemplate entering a lease option, and even then, I would counsel every seller I met against it. I don't think that there is any scenario where a lease option makes sense for any seller. If you have questions on this topic or any other, please log on to the Washington REALTORS website, www.warealtor.org. Click the links to the Legal Hotline Library and send a question to me if you'd like to ask me a question. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member.